In this episode, we're going to take the results of risk assessments and turn them into something leadership can actually manage over time, a living AI risk register. Beginners sometimes imagine a risk register as a spreadsheet that gets filled out once to satisfy a requirement, but a real risk register is more like a control dashboard for decision makers. It captures what the organization is worried about, who owns each concern, what controls exist, what actions are planned, and how risk is trending. AI makes the idea of a living register especially important because AI risk can change as data changes, as models drift, as vendors update features, and as teams expand use cases into new contexts. If the register is static, it becomes misleading because it reflects yesterday's understanding rather than today's risk posture. If the register is living, it becomes a powerful tool for prioritization, escalation, and defensible reporting because it shows leaders not just what risks exist, but whether those risks are being reduced and whether controls are operating. By the end, you should be able to explain what a living AI risk register contains, how it should be structured, how ownership and updates work, and how reporting turns the register into executive action rather than administrative record-keeping. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with the simple question a risk register answers, because that keeps it grounded. A risk register answers what could go wrong, how bad it could be, how likely it is, what is being done about it, and who is responsible for making sure it is controlled. For AI, those questions need to be answered in a way that reflects AI's unique characteristics, such as uncertain outputs, potential for bias, drift over time, and misuse by humans. The register should also connect each risk to an AI system or use case, because vague risk statements like AI could be biased are not actionable. Instead, the register should point to a specific context, like an AI tool used to prioritize complaints or a model used to influence eligibility decisions. That context makes it possible to assign ownership, define controls, and monitor relevant key risk indicators, KRIS. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking that the register exists to list every possible AI problem, when the real purpose is to track material risks that require management attention. The register is therefore a selection tool as much as a documentation tool, because it tells leadership what matters enough to be tracked, reviewed, and escalated. When the register is well designed, it becomes the backbone of consistent risk governance, connecting assessment outputs to operational action. Structure is the first major design decision, and structure matters because it determines whether the register is usable or whether it becomes a confusing pile of entries. A practical structure begins by identifying the unit of tracking, meaning what each entry represents. Some organizations track risks by AI system, others track risks by use case, and others track risks by specific risk themes that cut across systems, such as vendor data exposure or widespread shadow tool use. A useful approach for AI risk is often a hybrid, where each entry ties to a specific system or use case, but also tags the risk theme and the harm category, because that supports enterprise reporting. The register should have consistent fields that capture the essence of the risk, such as a clear risk statement, the potential harms, the affected stakeholders, the current controls, the residual risk level, and the planned treatments. It should also capture assumptions and limitations, because AI risks often depend on assumptions about data stability, user behavior, and vendor behavior. If assumptions change, the risk level can change quickly, and the register should support noticing that. Beginners should see that structure is not about making the register look formal. It is about making it searchable and comparable so leaders can see patterns and prioritize effectively. A strong AI risk register entry begins with a risk statement that is specific, plain language, and tied to outcomes rather than technical mechanics. A good risk statement might explain that an AI triage tool could misclassify high-severity complaints, leading to delayed response and trust harm. Another might explain that a vendor summarization feature could expose sensitive data if users input confidential content, leading to privacy harm and legal exposure. These statements describe what could happen, why it matters, and where it occurs, which makes them actionable. The entry should also capture the sources of risk, such as drift potential, training data limitations, user misuse likelihood, or lack of transparency from vendors, because those sources inform what controls are appropriate. It should then capture current controls, such as human review, restricted use policies, documentation requirements, monitoring thresholds, and escalation paths. Finally, it should capture residual risk, meaning the risk remaining after controls, because leadership decisions often depend on whether residual risk is within tolerance. Beginners sometimes struggle with residual risk because it feels subjective, but the register makes it more disciplined by requiring the assessor to state why risk is considered acceptable or not. The more consistent the register fields, the more consistent those judgments become across the organization. Owners are the next essential piece, because a register with no owners is a list of worries that nobody is responsible for solving. Ownership in a risk register should be aligned with accountability for outcomes, which usually means business owners for the processes influenced by AI. If an AI system affects customer decisions, a business leader responsible for that customer process should be the accountable owner, because they own the outcomes and can allocate resources for controls. Technical teams may be listed as operational owners or control owners, responsible for monitoring and maintenance, but the accountable risk owner should be clear. The register should also capture supporting roles, such as privacy, security, legal, and compliance reviewers, especially for high-impact risks. Clear ownership makes escalation and follow-through possible, because leadership can ask the owner what is being done and when it will be completed. It also prevents the vendor blame trap, where risk is pushed onto a third party even though the organization is responsible for its own decisions. A useful ownership design also includes an executive sponsor for critical risks, because some risks require enterprise-level decisions about risk appetite and investment. For beginners, the key point is that ownership turns risk management from a concept into a commitment, because someone is answerable for whether the risk stays within tolerance. Updates are what make the register living, and updates matter because AI risk changes with reality, not with documentation schedules. A living register has defined triggers for when entries must be reviewed and updated, such as major system changes, expansion to new users, changes in data sources, or monitoring signals indicating drift or rising harm. It also has a regular cadence where owners review their entries even if no trigger occurred, because the absence of triggers does not guarantee stability. Updates should include changes in control effectiveness, such as whether monitoring is being performed on schedule, whether documentation remains current, and whether incident patterns are emerging. Updates should also capture progress on treatments, such as whether a policy gap has been closed, whether training has been completed, or whether a vendor contract change has been implemented. Another important update type is changes in external expectations, such as new regulatory guidance or new industry expectations that affect defensibility. A beginner misunderstanding is that updating a register is busy work, but in reality, updates are the mechanism by which leadership can see whether risk is being reduced and whether controls are keeping up with change. If the register is updated only after a crisis, it is not a risk register, it is an incident log. A living register is proactive, and that proactivity is what reduces surprise. The register should also include a disciplined way to track treatments, because risk management is not complete until actions are defined and followed through. A treatment might involve avoiding a use case, reducing risk through controls, transferring risk through contracts or insurance, accepting risk with documented justification, or retiring a system that cannot be controlled. In the register, treatments should be expressed as concrete actions with owners and deadlines, because vague treatments like improve monitoring do not create accountability. Treatments should also be linked to the risk statement and control gaps, so it is clear what the action is meant to change. For example, if a risk stems from misuse, the treatment might include training, restrictions on tool use, and improved detection of unapproved usage. If a risk stems from drift potential, the treatment might include a monitoring plan with thresholds and periodic reassessment triggers. If a risk stems from vendor opacity, the treatment might include contract requirements for transparency and limitations disclosure, or it might include additional internal safeguards that reduce reliance. By linking treatments to the risk drivers, the register becomes a planning tool, not a record. Beginners should see that this treatment discipline is what allows leadership to invest wisely, because resources can be directed to actions that reduce material risk rather than to generic activity. Reporting is the final element that turns a register into leadership value, because without reporting, the register becomes a private database rather than a governance mechanism. Reporting should summarize what risks are most material, how risk levels are trending, and where controls are weak or overloaded. It should also highlight which risks exceed tolerance and require escalation, because those are the risks leaders must actively decide how to address. A strong reporting approach uses shared language aligned to enterprise risk management, (ERM), so AI risks can be compared to other risks rather than being treated as isolated technology issues. Reporting should also distinguish between inherent risk and residual risk at a high level, because leadership wants to know not just that the use case is high impact, but whether controls have reduced the risk to an acceptable level. Another valuable reporting dimension is control health, such as whether documentation is current, whether monitoring is on schedule, and whether exception use is increasing, because those signals show whether the program is functioning. Reporting should be predictable, with a cadence that matches the organization's risk governance rhythm, and it should include the ability to escalate out of cycle when KRI thresholds are crossed. Beginners should recognize that reporting is not about producing a thick packet. It is about creating actionable visibility that supports decisions. A well-designed register also supports grouping and trend analysis, because leaders need to see patterns, not just individual entries. For example, the register may reveal that many risks relate to vendor data exposure, suggesting a need for stronger vendor governance standards. It may reveal that many risks relate to misuse of public tools, suggesting a need for improved policy clarity and approved tool alternatives. It may reveal that many high-impact use cases lack consistent monitoring, suggesting a resource gap that leadership must address. These patterns are hard to see when risks are managed in isolated projects, but they become visible when entries share consistent fields and tags. This is one reason the register should capture common categories, like harm type, impact level, and risk driver, because those tags enable aggregation. Beginners sometimes fear that structured fields make the register rigid, but structure actually creates flexibility because it allows many different risks to be compared using the same vocabulary. It also supports assurance, because reviewers can check whether required fields are complete and whether updates occurred on schedule. A register that supports pattern analysis helps leadership move from reacting to individual incidents to improving systemic controls, which is how risk programs mature. A common mistake is turning the register into a dumping ground for every concern anyone raises, which can bury the truly material risks. A living register should focus on material risks, meaning risks that have meaningful likelihood and impact or that require management attention because controls are not adequate. Lesser concerns can be tracked elsewhere, such as in issue logs or operational backlogs, but the risk register should remain the place where leadership can see and prioritize the risks that matter most. Another mistake is allowing entries to remain vague, which makes ownership and treatments meaningless. A third mistake is failing to update entries, which creates false confidence and can mislead leadership into thinking risk is controlled. A fourth mistake is assigning owners who do not have decision authority or resource control, which creates responsibility without power and leads to stalled treatments. A fifth mistake is reporting only counts of risks rather than trends and control effectiveness, which can cause leaders to focus on the wrong signals. For beginners, these mistakes are valuable to remember because exam scenarios often describe a risk register that exists but does not function, and the correct answer usually involves making it living through ownership, updates, and actionable reporting. To make this concrete, imagine an organization has a high-impact AI use case that influences which customer disputes are escalated. The risk register entry would state the risk in plain terms, such as the possibility that high-severity disputes are misclassified, causing delayed response and trust and legal harm. It would record the impact classification as high due to customer outcomes and potential regulatory scrutiny, and it would identify risk drivers like drift potential and reliance patterns. It would list controls like human review for certain categories, monitoring thresholds, and documentation of limitations, and it would state residual risk based on those controls. It would assign the accountable business owner responsible for dispute resolution outcomes and the operational owner responsible for monitoring. It would include treatments such as tightening classification criteria, improving monitoring signals, and updating training for reviewers, with deadlines and follow-up. It would define update triggers such as a change in dispute patterns or an increase in complaints, and it would include reporting expectations such as monthly risk status updates and immediate escalation if KRI thresholds are crossed. This example shows how a register entry becomes a management artifact that drives action rather than a static description. Beginners should see that the value is in the living nature, because that is what keeps oversight aligned to reality. To close, building a living AI risk register is about creating a structured, owned, and regularly updated view of AI risks that leadership can use to prioritize, escalate, and defend decisions. Structure matters because it determines whether entries are comparable and actionable, and strong entries are specific, outcome-focused, and tied to particular systems and use cases. Ownership matters because risk management requires accountable owners with authority, supported by operational owners who run controls and monitoring. Updates matter because AI risk changes as systems, data, vendors, and reliance patterns change, and the register must reflect current reality rather than past assumptions. Treatments matter because risk must be reduced, accepted with justification, transferred with clear responsibility, or retired, and those actions require concrete plans and accountability. Reporting matters because it turns the register into executive visibility, aligning AI risk with ERM language and highlighting trends, control health, and tolerance breaches. When a register is truly living, it prevents surprises by making risk posture visible and manageable, and it becomes one of the strongest operational tools in Domain 2 for running an AI risk program responsibly over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.